I thought I would just kind of recap a little bit on renters' rights, because although it came in on the 1st of May, there still seems to be a few folks who perhaps aren't too clear on what they should be doing, and how it's going to impact on them. So just a few reminders. If you have served a Section 21 prior to the 1st of May, you've only got until the end of July to get that registered at court, because otherwise it will just die and you can't use it. Those of you who did your tenancies prior to the 1st of May for your students coming in this year, make sure that you've issued them with the written notice that you could rely on ground 4A. If you don't do that, then when it comes to sort of the end of term next year, you won't be able to use that ground to recover the property if they don't move out. And just again a reminder, ground 4A this year, you can give 2 months notice. Going forward after that, it's going to be back to 4 months. If anybody hasn't issued the notice to the students, then there's an example of what you can actually say. So doing your tenancies now, going forward, please remember you can't accept any rent until the tenancy's been signed by everybody. Whereas before, you maybe get them to send the rent, send the deposit, then you would get the tenancy all signed up. It doesn't work that way anymore. So you need to make sure that your tenancy is all signed, then they pay the money. They can pay the deposit up front, which I do recommend, because that way you can get it protected, and when you're signing up the tenancy, you can get them to sign the deposit certificate, sorry, Kath, and give them the prescribed information. And the maximum, as we've been saying, is 1 month's rent. And I'm going to touch on something on that a little bit later on. Deposits still remain at maximum of 5 weeks rent. So once your tenants are in, bear in mind on day 1 they can give you notice. So don't think, although they might have told you they're going to be there a year, it doesn't necessarily follow. So you need to be prepared and always ready to sort of remarket a property if your tenant actually gives you notice there. That 2 months could be nearer 3, because the notice must end either on a rent day or the day before. So if they give it you in the middle of the month, sorry, but the 2 months isn't to the middle of 2 months further down the line. It's got to tally with the rent. And remind them that they are going to have to pay their rent during that notice period. The only bit under the Renters' Rights Act that I think landlords are able to have a little bit of power is if you have a joint tenancy and one tenant gives notice that they want to end that tenancy, then that will impact on all the tenants. Right? So one out, all out. But when the others twist his arm because they don't want to move out, and he then comes back and says, oh, I've been talking to my friends and we've decided we're actually going to stay on, we don't want to leave. You have the right at that point to accept their notice and say, tough, on your bike, sunshine, or you can accept the notice and basically cancel it and carry on. But whatever decision you make, please, please, please put it in writing. Don't do it verbally. Like, going forward, all your interactions with your tenants should be written. Email, post, whatever it is. And I'm going to keep banging on about this as well. How many people have their tenants' details so that they can contact them, a phone number, email address? Or should I say, does anybody not have that? Right. So you use an agent. Yeah. Using an agent is fine because it gets around this. However, if you have, or your agent provides you with a copy of the referencing documentation that has all their information on, then you then all of a sudden are in possession of that information. And under GDPR, if we hold information on somebody, we have to be registered with the Information Commissioner's Office. So if you aren't registered, my advice would be, whether you run your lettings through a company, whether you do them personally, doesn't matter. Whoever holds the information, register. If you do both, then you register twice. And like I say, I think what you're going to find going forward, particularly when it comes to councils and they get their act together and realise that this could be a nice little income stream for them because landlords haven't complied with the Renters' Rights Act as they should, it's important to keep your records and do things in writing. If they do complain about repair issues, don't ignore it. Acknowledge it, do something in writing, and deal with it. Particularly if it's an issue around damp or mould. Where you use an agent, please remember, at the end of the day, if something goes wrong, your agent doesn't do their job properly, it's you that will end up in court, not the agent. Well, not initially anyway. I'm quite sure you'll then counterclaim against them. But in the initial part, you're the one. So you need to be sure that your agent is doing things correctly, has served the notices, has protected deposits, things like that. If it's managed and they're supposed to do quarterly inspections or whenever, make sure you ask them for a copy of their inspection report to show what they have done, because if further down the line you get a repair problem from the tenant and it then becomes apparent that actually this isn't a new issue, it's been ongoing for a while, then if your agent hasn't highlighted it in their inspection report, you have got some grounds to go back to them for negligence. And again, part of this record keeping and making sure you do things right. I'm very sorry to say this, but I don't think the councils up here, in my experience of them, will take a similar view to those councils that looked on Rachel from complaints when she forgot to license our property down south. And sort of said, oh, that's all right, genuine mistake, we'll carry on. I think you'll find up here, you'll get a fine. And the other thing is, keep your paperwork for 6 years. I know it's a pain in the proverbial, but statute of limitations, particularly when it comes to deposits, tenants have got 6 years to come back and claim that you didn't protect the deposit. If you've binned everything, it might be more difficult for you to be able to prove that the deposit was actually protected, that they did sign the certificate, that you did give them prescribed information. Interesting stat here on rent increases or rent inflation. April, May, it was nominal, 1.7%. June, it went up to 6.5%. Why do we think that might be? Landlords getting out is one explanation. Perhaps the Renters' Rights Act and people realising that they're only going to be able to put the rent up once a year, so hang on, let's get in now and get so that the clock starts ticking. But 6.5% is quite a substantial increase. And going forward, please make sure your rent increases are reasonable. Don't make them unreasonable, because your tenants can challenge them for free. There's a bit of a backlog with the tribunals, and when they look at it, they will look for evidence that this is a fair increase. They may well decide that it's not a fair increase, and they'll put it down. Whereas prior to May, a tribunal could look at the rent and say, well, actually, the landlord's been rather generous. The rent should actually be more than he's asking for. So accordingly, we're going to allocate or award that rent to the tenant. So there was an element of risk for the tenant. Now, the rent can only go one way, stick as it is or go down. So some people would say, well, why would a tenant not challenge the rent? The worst that's going to happen is I'm going to have to pay it. The best is it might come down, but on top of that, I'm not going to have to pay that increase until it's been to a tribunal and there's a decision made, because the tribunal will not backdate it.
What happens in that interim period that they just refuse to pay?
No, the rent continues to be payable at the old figure until it gets to the tribunal. And then the tribunal decides, sets the rent going forward, and that is the rent that the tenant has to pay from that day onwards.
When does the 12 months start again?
From
After you order, or when you first put it up?
If it's challenged, my understanding is the 12 month is from the date of the tribunal. So it could actually be 18 months before you can put it up again, because you've got 6 months waiting for the tribunal to make a decision, and then your 12 months starts again from there. And sorry? When you want to put the rent up, my advice to you is a little bit like surveyors doing evaluation on a property. You look to see what the market figures are. You collect, you print out other properties similar to yours that are currently on the market and what they're being advertised to rent at, so that you can demonstrate that what you're asking for is in line with what the market is. If you don't go to the tribunal with a bit of evidence, then the chances are, unfortunately, you're not really going to be successful. The better prepared you are, the more evidence you are, but rather than going to the tribunal, my advice, like everything to do with tenants, is communication. Talk to them, explain, I'm going to have to put the rent up. do you think that X pounds would be a reasonable amount? I've done some research. This is what similar properties are costing in the area. And try and, get them to buy in. What I would say is, and I do keep saying this, you don't have to put the rent up every year. Right? But what you do need to do is have a conversation with the tenant every year to say, it's 12 months down the road, we need to look at the rent. Yes, the rent should be X pounds, but you know what? You've been a nice tenant, whatever. I'm happy to keep it as it is for another 12 months. But that doesn't mean that in 12 months' time, I won't have to put it up again. And they then feel that perhaps you're trying to be reasonable. And under the new scheme, the tribunal can actually pass any appeal costs back to the landlord if the tenant goes to appeal and challenges the initial finding. I've stuck this one in really as a reminder for you as individual landlords, because you should be finding that your agent, if you use an agent, is asking you these kind of questions, so that you don't think, what's it? Those of you who have bought or sold properties, I'm sure you will have found that every time you go to solicitors, they want ID, the checking bank accounts, all that sort of thing. Even though you used them 6 months ago, they'll still go through the same process. And just to sort of why they're doing them, verifying the identities. There is an awful lot more identity fraud nowadays. And also from the tenants. I'll call them the problematic tenants, the people who perhaps we don't want to rent to. May well try to purport to be somebody else. And if you don't do your checks properly, I mean, I'm going back a number of years, but landlords were very keen to keep the cost down, and they would go and stick an advert in the local paper shop window, tenant wanted. And the degree of checking left a lot to be desired. And generally speaking, a few months later, they discovered why that tenant had gone through the paper shop rather than going through an agent. But that's...
On the right to rent. Did that just come in last year as well, or has that been in?
It's been in a long time.
That's all I thought. I was thinking it was just...
No, but it's still... It's becoming more and more applicable because of the illegal immigrants in the country, and it's trying to make sure that the people who are renting are entitled to be here. If you do find one that doesn't pass it, then my advice to you is you contact the Home Office and report it. Because if you just turn a blind eye and say, sorry, I can't rent you because you haven't passed the right to rent check, what's going to happen? They're just going to go and find somebody else who isn't perhaps as thorough. So the only way to try to make this work is if somebody isn't meeting the standards, you report them. And we've talked about the rental ombudsman scheme that's coming in with the Renters' Rights Act. And the latest that I've got on that is that it isn't going to apply to letting agents. It will just apply to landlords. They haven't got a start date yet, but it's supposed to be going to be this year. So that means it's going to be probably November or December. See when they can do it. But it is anticipated that it's going to apply both to landlords in the private sector and also the social sector. And it will have the power to award or make decisions with financial penalties up to 25 grand that will be binding on landlords. Right. I'm going to go off script a little bit. Sorry. Somebody was talking to me tonight about HMOs and student tenancies and tenancies generally. And already we are seeing quite a lot of students who on the 1st of May had a tenancy that ran through till the back end of the summer, giving notice that they would be leaving at the back end of June, which left landlords with a void for a couple of months that basically they couldn't do anything about. I mean, there was one agent, allegedly, the cancellations for them amounted to about 60 grand. And depending upon numbers, it can be significant. And we were talking about how can we overcome this, because there are two issues going forward. One, you can't sign a tenancy more than 6 months before the start date. So if you have students going in who would normally go in August or September, then you can't sign the tenancy until February. So the current or the old system where students came to Newcastle in October, within 2 or 3 weeks they were deciding who they wanted to live with next year, and they were getting signed up for a property for next summer. That obviously is going to change. How it will change remains to be seen. Whether agents start to advertise around Easter time for the coming year, I can't answer. But we come back to the question of, you have students who tell you that they want to take the place for a year, which historically has been the way most students have operated. We've worked on a 12-month tenancy basis. Going forward, because it's a rolling contract, quite possibly they will sign a tenancy in September, to start in September, but they will be serving notice because they want to leave at the back end of June, because that's when they can go home. They don't need to be in Newcastle. Does this make sense to people? So the question is, as a landlord, how can we try to guard against this? It's not an easy one. One potential solution is you expect them to stay for 10 months. So you work out what would the rent be for 12 months. Then divide that figure by 10, and that's what you charge them. And if they stay for 12 months, you've actually made a bit of money. But if they leave in June, as is quite possible, then you're no worse off. So there's one potential way to deal with it. Another potential way could be that you set the tenancy up that you've calculated the rent on the 10-month basis, and what you have is a tenancy whereby they pay rent at X pounds a month for 10 months, but then they have 2 months where they don't pay any rent. And then they start again, so that it's in a 12-month cycle. And within every 12 months, they pay for 10 and 2 are free. Now, nobody can tell me whether this is legit or not.
Bruce, can you not put like a clause in there, like a pause clause for students?
No,
Over the summer?
that would be terribly wrong, because we can't penalise people, because they have to have an open-ended tenancy to stay for as long as they want.
Yeah, it'd still be open, but something in there.
Yes, but
Clause.
I'm afraid our politicians don't look at this in a logical way. So, as I say, I haven't got any firm answers for you. Those of you that have known me a while will know I tend to try and think outside the box. And so, it's like everything. If this is the...
Sorry,
Yeah?
are landlords starting tenancies earlier in July? Because a lot of people seem to be doing that now, where they're starting in July because they need a house, so they're going to have to commit from July
Well,
on the basis that the last 2 months will be free.
they could be, Serby. I think, I mean, certainly I haven't had any feedback yet. I think that this summer will be very much a testing period for landlords to, and agents to kind of work out how they deal with this, you know, how big the problem is. I think next year it could well be different. One of the problems, as I see it, of trying to get everybody starting in July is that we haven't got enough cleaners, painters, plumbers, sparkies to actually deal with all the student properties that want to change over because they've moved out on the 30th of June and hell or high water, the next lot's moving in on the 1st of July. Now, it might be that you want to sort of look at trying to give yourself a window, and you don't start on the 1st of July, you start on the 7th of July or the 8th of July, so that you've got a few days in which to turn the property round.
So my own daughter is renting in Bristol, and her tenancy finished on the 22nd or 23rd of June, presumably for that reason, because they had, foreplanned for this, that then the next lot of tenants going on the 1st of July.
That could well be,
Several agents have said the same about starting in July.
yeah. I mean, those of you who use agents, I would suggest it as a conversation to be having with them. What are they recommending? Because at the end of the day, they're the ones who are going to have to make it work for you. But
Listen, I'm not a student landlord, but just from what you've said, would the licensing have something to say about charging 12 months rent over 10 months and giving 2 months free? Might be
Well-
a bit of a management issue there.
this is why I say, like everything I say, it does not, it is not gospel. It is the word according to Bruce. It's not advice. It's just thoughts for you to think about and do with as you wish. I'm not telling you how to do things. I'm trying to just put ideas out there for you to go away and work on and see if it works for you. With the 2 months free one, I don't know how licensing will look on it. What I would say is, if the tenancy is done that the rent is payable for 10 months and then there are 2 months free and then payable for 10 months and 2 months free, I would dress it up as this is a buffer for the tenant to be able to put some money to one side for Christmas or for something else.
I think you're very hopeful. I think if you go to the ombudsman or...
Well, it might get taken.
It's
But-
also the wording of the contract, so if you say it's the monthly rent of this, which is an inflated rent, and that's above market rent, that's likely to be challenged.
Yeah.
But if you say the rent for this tenancy is a 12-month period rent, which is this, payable in 10 installments of this, and that's
price.
annual rent rather than monthly rent.
And then when they give you the notice, they'll want the extra, they'll want those 2 months paid back.
No, because they come as free.
Are you not then taking,
Payable in tenant
some,
installments.
are you taking a bit of rent in advance then? If you do it,
Well, this is
charge
what
them for 10,
all I'm
12 months.
all I'm saying is
There's 20 quid
somebody
in
threw the
advance.
question at me, and I was trying to think of solutions. I'm not saying that what I'm saying will stand up in court. What I'm and it might need fine tuning, and it is the sort of thing that I think the wording is where Serby and her people come in to try to make that wording be watertight, that it complies with the legalities of what it is.
Then you go with your first option, which was, you don't mention anything about 2 months free, that's just the new rent.
Yeah.
It's a monthly contract, so there's nothing to do with annual.
Yeah, that would be the simple one. But what you need to bear in mind is that certainly in the first few years, the chances are those rents are going to be a little bit higher than maybe other people who are spreading it over the 12. So those rents could get challenged as being on the high side, or it may be that tenants will go to a different property because it's cheaper, until other landlords cotton on to what you're doing and everybody starts doing it. But I don't know what the landscape's going to be. All I'm trying to do is chuck a few ideas out for people. You know, let's think about it. I don't know if anybody watched, I watched a programme last night on Channel 4 about the about getting rich. I can't remember the correct title of it. Something about being filthy rich. It was a left economist who has this idea that anybody with assets of over 10 million should pay a 2% wealth tax. And what we need to do is actually start redistributing the wealth. So those of you with a few houses, that's unfair because there's people who haven't got the same advantage as you. And you should be actually getting rid of your houses to help them so that they can have properties. If you're interested, I will go and find it on Catch-Up. I found it quite interesting. But one of the people he interviewed was a guy called Dan Needle, those of you who go on the internet may have come across him. He's a bit of a tax expert, and he certainly gave him a little bit of a hard time, and the guy was struggling to come up with answers and didn't like what Dan was saying. But the bottom line is, I'm sorry, you know, he thinks that people will pay the tax because that's the way it is, and they won't leave the country or they won't find ways round it. But it was an interesting watch. So anyway, you've got...
Just getting back to the students, on the other end of the scale, if you like, say if you got students for 12 months, they stay there for 12 months, so say they're supposed to finish at the end of June, and you've got new students lined up for the 1st of July, but the students get jobs locally or something like that, and they decide they want to stay on,
You're snookered.
and I can't evict them now. What do I say to the students who are coming in? What do I say, here's your deposit back, sorry, I can't take it away, you're going to have to look for something.
The legal aspect is you have a contract to house those people from the 1st of July. So you have a legal obligation. Yeah, hang on. Forget what is happening round about. You have a legal obligation. So it could well be that they turn around to you and say, well, you're going to have to find us temporary accommodation until you can give us the house then. So you'll have to fund a hotel or something else for them. So, you know, this is where it starts to get a little bit iffy. And you need to make sure you've served your tenants with that notice that you could rely on ground 4A. And it is important that you serve that notice at least 4 months ahead, so that if they don't move out at the end, you can go to court immediately on the basis of that ground. Because if you haven't done it correctly and you're then having to start serving your notice at the end of June because other people want to be in at the beginning of July, I'm sorry, you've got 4 months anyway before you can actually get to court. So you're probably going to end up writing off a year. So it is important that you get all your ducks in a row, as they say. Do that.